War. War never changes. Ever since America's conception, birthed in the fire of revolution, it has been at war. From Antietam to Normandy to Saigon, America has fought valiantly for freedom against the evils of the world, at least in its own eyes. How would America fare, however, after being pushed to the brink like never before, against a foe its technological equal, fighting for survival? By the 2050s, the world was on the edge of collapse. There were shortages of every major resource, and the remaining world powers were willing to fight to make sure they controlled whatever remained. In 2052, the European Commonwealth, desperate to secure their supplies of increasingly scarce crude oil, invaded the Middle East as oil prices continued to rise. Unable to find a peaceful solution to the conflict, nations began rapidly withdrawing from the United Nations, resulting in its dissolution on July 26th. Eventually, the conflict between Europe and the Middle East went nuclear, with detonations all throughout the land Europe had come to conquer for themselves. By the time the oil fields were secured, they were either destroyed or depleted. This fruitless war ended up bankrupting many of the smaller Commonwealth members, and left the rest fighting over whatever remained. America wasn't blind to the state of the rest of the world, taking the precautions necessary to secure its interests. As the last of the Texan oil fields dried up, the U.S. began placing severe sanctions on Mexico in the interest of protecting their oil imports. In 2051, the U.S. would invade Mexico, citing the Southern Republic's economic and civil instability. The U.S. would continue to occupy Mexico indefinitely. Domestically, the U.S. government knew that it was only a matter of time before some catastrophe struck. Whether it be war, like in the Middle East, or the growing new plague that was spreading across the nation, the government had to have some kind of plan in place should the end come. Vault-Tec, the soon-to-be most valuable company in the world, was commissioned by the government as part of Project Safehouse to create 122 vaults, complexes designed to house the American people in case the worst should come to pass. At least, that was their stated goal. But that, as a wise storyteller once said, is a story for another day. In the North, America began taking measures to secure its last natural oil reserves in Alaska, knowing that possession of one of Earth's last functioning oil wells made them a target. Defenses were erected around Anchorage. Masses of troops were stationed in and around the state. America attempted, unsuccessfully, to persuade Canada to allow troop movements throughout Canadian territory, straining relations between the two. The American forethought was well placed, as in the winter of 2066, the People's Republic of China invaded Alaska. The Americans and Chinese had been in a Cold War for years, resulting in a substantial military buildup on both sides, combined with subterfuge efforts, such as the Chinese sabotage at Niagara. When China began experiencing their own energy crisis, their only option was to invade. America bolstered a swift defense against the invasion. General Constantine Chase was placed in charge of repelling the invaders, a task which he took to with enthusiasm. The early stages of the war were messy, with friendly fire incidents such as when the cruiser USS Ebon Atoll was misidentified and sunk by the submarine USS Interference. The US also struggled to get Canadian permission to move troops through their territory and airspace, with the Canadians eventually relenting. Despite the early setbacks, Chase's army was able to halt the PLA's advance, turning the war from a quick campaign of conquest into a drawn-out war of attrition. On the home front, the American people were as patriotic as ever. The last few years for the US have been filled with strife, as the resource shortages made everyday life for the average American increasingly difficult. But this new enemy, in the form of the Chinese, united the American people in defense of their nation. Though this wave of patriotism was also paired with a wave of paranoia against communists and Chinese people. Hotlines were established to turn in suspected communists. Children were taught to turn in their parents into the authorities for the smallest infractions. Even the most baseless accusations could ruin a person's life. In a grim reflection of Executive Order 9066, ordered by President Franklin Roosevelt, that placed Japanese Americans in concentration camps during World War II, the President ordered Executive Order 99066, placing Chinese Americans in camps like Turtle Dove and Little Yangtze. While some of these people were correctly imprisoned, like Chinese spy Wan Yang, it was far more common for completely innocent Americans to be put in deplorable conditions simply because of their race. Men, women, and children were ripped from their homes across the nation and forced to pay for the sins of a country many of them had never set foot in. The unluckiest among them were even victims of terrible experiments. For years, the war was at an effective standstill, with neither side able to make substantial gains. Even the deployment of the T-45D model of power armor by the Americans did almost nothing to advance the war effort. America did, however, slowly start to wean itself off of using fossil fuels in favor of nuclear energy. The microfusion cell had been invented the year China invaded, and, with this new technology, America would enter a new age of innovation, creating new weapons, vehicles, personal robot butlers, and so much more. Alaska's oil was still needed for many things, such as creating plastics, but every step the US took towards decreasing its dependence on oil was a step in the right direction. American-Canadian relations took another blow in 2072 when Canadian unrest due to the war resulted in an attempted sabotage of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. In the name of national security, America began to occupy Canada, starting the process for it to become the next American Commonwealth on June 3rd. This served to further embolden the Canadian protesters and rebels who will continue to fight against their American occupiers throughout the course of the war. To little success. As the lines in Alaska continued to hold, America opened a new front when they launched their counter-invasion of China in 2074. America would make landings across the massive nations, with troops ending up as far as the Gobi Desert. Still, fighting a war on their home front seemed to have next to no effect on Chinese forces in Alaska, and they remained entrenched. Both sides began to get desperate for a decisive victory and began putting resources into the development of superweapons. For the Chinese, 2075 saw the creation of the Ghost Fleet, a generation of stealth submarines that outshined any the Americans might have. China also began development of their own power armor suits, though there are no reports of them ever being fielded. The Americans, on the other hand, developed the Stealth Boy, a personal stealth device created using stealth technology from captured Chinese He-Wei stealth armor. The US also commissioned the robotics companies General Atomics and Robco, both of whom had created combat robots for the military to create a weapon that would be able to end the war in one fell swoop. Liberty Prime. A 40-foot tall, nuke-hurling, communist-hating robot. If deployed, Liberty Prime would have been among the most devastating weapons ever devised. Sadly for the Americans, that future would never come to pass, as problems with the robot's power supply could never be resolved. One of the US's research projects did pay off, however. Improving upon the underperforming T-45D, the T-51B model of power armor would turn the tide of the war. Deployed to China in June of 2076, the T-51 power armor would accelerate the American offensive, causing the Chinese supply lines to collapse, meaning they were unable to resupply their occupation force in Alaska. In January of 2077, General Chase launched Operation Anchorage, a major offensive that saw the Chinese troops expelled from American soil. The war in America was over. Even though the Americans had re-established complete control of Alaska, civil unrest continued to grow. The invasion of China was still raging, using up resources that could have been going to the civilian population. Riots broke out across the country as access to food was restricted, and Canadian protesters still clashed with American soldiers. These riots were countered viciously, with soldiers, robots, and even power armor, both the T-51 and the new T-60 model. Despite the exponentially increasing tension at home, America was definitely winning the war, and seemed to be on its way to completely take over its communist rival. Until October 23rd, 2077. 3 minutes after midnight, the U.S. Pacific Fleet reports sighting 3 unidentified submerged objects off the Californian coast. 3 hours later, high-altitude bombers are spotted off the Bering Strait. 6 hours later, NORAD confirms nuclear launches aimed at the mainland United States. The president quickly authorizes retaliatory strikes, but nothing more can be done. Vegas was saved because of the foresight of Robert House, who installed highly advanced defense systems to spare his favorite city. The rest of the US isn't as lucky. LA, Boston, DC, and every other major American city is destroyed. The world as it was known is over. But it was not the end of humanity, as some may have predicted. Instead, the apocalypse was simply the prologue to another
bloody chapter of human history. For man had succeeded in destroying the world. But war never changes.